Now, these two have put everything on the line to try to be faithful to the Lord, and they failed. They apostatized when everyone was counting on them to stay heroic to the last breath. But what's amazing is that every time he fails, he rises up again and he perseveres even more, just like St. Peter. Without them, the Church of Korea wouldn't have happened. They're kind of like the founding fathers. Hello, and today I would like to continue the sharing of the first stages, the infancy of the Church of Korea, by focusing on two key characters. These guys are like the founding fathers of the church over there. The names are Seung and Pyok. In Korean culture, the last name comes first. So is Lee in American culture. So in English, it would be pronounced like Seung Lee and Pyok Lee. But yeah, so here we go. The reason why I share about these two is because without them, the Church of Korea wouldn't have happened officially. So it's kind of like Saints Peter and Paul, right? They're kind of like the founding fathers. They're the stones on which the church is built. And so let's do a quick review from the last podcast. So we remember that Seung was the first baptized, right? He went to the Southern Church of China, the South Church, and he was baptized by the priest named Louis de Gramont. And he was baptized with the name of Peter because he would be the first of Korea to receive the vocation, the call to holiness. So he goes back to Korea with all, these rich paraphernalia, crucifixes, sacred art, and church doctrine. And he shares this with Pyok. And now Pyok is so excited, right? Because he's been anticipating to just absorb this and eat it up so that he can go out and evangelize, to share the mission with great passion to everyone around him, all the other scholars. So when he arrives, Pyok takes this and he immediately goes to another very famous scholar. His name is Ka-hwan. And this scholar is celebrated and decorated because he has had quite a successful career teaching Confucianism. Now, before we go even further, I want to caveat this by explaining that in Korean history, right, Confucianism is for them like Judeo-Christianity for us in the United States. Like without Confucianism, the entire country's society doesn't have a backbone. So the same way for us to have Judeo-Christian holidays, Christmas, and to really take those holidays off, or even like in our mannerisms or in like the national anthem, or when we say the Pledge of Allegiance, we call upon God as one nation seeking his protection. Well, in Korea, with Confucianism, it's the same idea. And so even in the palace, you have certain boundaries and classes where people cannot engage each other in your classes, right? With the common folk, the scholars, in the imperial court, the nobles. And so you have to imagine if Christianity, this Western religion, enters into this world, this culture, all of a sudden, anyone who abides by this culture, the entire country feels threatened, right? This is a total scandal. And so anyone who introduces this Western thought is totally crazy, right? I mean, it's kind of like the same thing for us today when we're in this post-Christian society and we experience Christianity really falling from our fingertips, where we no longer are able to share the truth freely, in a sense, without being persecuted. And so it's very understandable as they carry on this formal debate that Ka-hwan is very, very upset. But they have a formal debate, so, it's very PC. They have 3 days, and, it's a very formal, you share your point, I share my point, thesis, antithesis, and then what's our synthesis. And, this is totally open to the public, so anyone is able to chime in or to watch and engage. So like scholarly friends from the nobles are allowed to sit in and watch and observe, and also the common folk are allowed to come in and observe. So this is actually a really big deal. And so what's very interesting is Pyok gets to listen, and Ka-hwan first begins the debate, and he begins by firing against the Catholic Church's doctrine and trying to prove why it's false. And Pyok fires back, explaining that these errors are actually true and that the Christian God is true. And he takes down every one of Kahwan's points, point by point, using logic in a very systematic way. And so it was amazing. Like, he was just taking every argument blow for blow, and with such clarity in the church's doctrine, it's said that he brought such great light and conviction. And so the arguments, they say, were as brilliant as the sun. They struck like a hurricane and they cut like a sword. And so the onlookers, they were so delighted. And it was really a moment, a platform for great conversions. So what happened was, at the end of the 3 days, Kahwan was totally defeated. And he pronounced these words that are recorded and translated as such. Christianity is magnificent, and it is true. But Christianity brings pain and suffering to its partisans. What is to be done? And it is said that after this, he withdrew and never again opened his mouth on the subject of religion, because it was just so embarrassing. Now, that said, Pyok then later on took on the baptismal name of John the Baptist. It'd be really cool if he was Paul, because then it'll be like Peter and Paul, but it's all good, But what's interesting about Seung is that, again, he's the first baptized named Peter. And like St. Peter, he was so passionate, right? And he's kind of like the bull in the china shop. Like, he just wants to go and he just wants to spread the good news. But what happens is that you have your first martyr of Korea. And it's none of the first two. Rather, it is a friend of theirs, another scholar named Kim Pomu. And his baptismal name is Thomas. So I'll call him Thomas Kim. And Thomas Kim was not one of those more notable scholars. He was a friend, and he joined them in their inner circles to study together. But he was caught, and he was used kind of as bait to get others to fold. And mind you, at this time, while Christianity was discussed and debated formally, no one was actually persecuted yet, right? Because this is the first martyr, the proto-martyr. And so this man, Thomas, was made as an example, and he was put through several different kinds of torture that were really intense. Now, this is the beautiful part of the story, is that the Korean Catholics were really like a band of brothers. And especially this first class, upon hearing that their brother Thomas was being persecuted, they immediately ran and they confronted the torturers, the government, so to speak. And these were really prominent influencers in society. These scholars they had names for themselves. It's really like Jordan Peterson or Steven Crowder or all these guys who have a certain gravitas, and a certain level of respect because of their intellectual capacity. And so they appeared. So, for example, Francis Xavier Kwan, he appeared along with the other Christians, and they were all respected. So the government knew they couldn't touch them, because if they did, that would have been like a total scandal, and all of society might wreak havoc, and they might actually want to support Christianity. So the government decided to back off, right? But because, for example, Francis Xavier Kwan said, and I quote, "All of us profess the same religion as Thomas Kim Pomu. We wish to share the same fate that you are reserving for him." And so, out of fear of there being a revolt, they let him go, but they didn't actually let him go. They dismissed him by sending him to another place in which he was to continue saying his prayers, but at a cost of, being exiled into this town called Tanyang. Now, while he was sent there, because he was brutally beaten, he actually died. And this was actually very scary for Catholics, because they realized what's actually at stake, that now their lives are at danger, they're at risk. During this time then, both the families of Pyok and Seung, they were afraid for their lives, because they're like, oh my gosh, by virtue of being associated, related to these Catholics, like we might also become, because in Confucian society, if someone does something wrong, the whole family can be punished, right? So they realized, oh my gosh, like we might actually die because of what they believe. And so, for example, for Seung or Peter Lee, his younger brother named Chun, he felt this pressure. And so he really attacked Peter to try to get him to revert, to speak against the faith. And he harassed his brother Peter so much that Peter actually got cold feet, and he burned all his religious books, and he wrote an open letter to basically justify himself and denounce the Christian faith. And then actually, that is the first time, but that isn't the only time, because there's one more time where Lee Seung-hoon renounces his faith because he gets cold feet one more time. And that is when, along with weaker-minded Catholics, there was this fear of the abandoning of ancestral worship. And at that point, a lot of Catholics got cold feet and were leaving the faith, whereas others were stepping up even more heroically. And during that time, he apostatized that second time. So it's almost like St. Peter, during the Passion of Christ, when Jesus says, you're going to deny me twice before the cock crows 3 times, and it literally happens, right? So you have to imagine Lee Seung-hoon being the first baptized layman in this heroic legacy of the Korean Catholic Church, where there's no priests and all these faithful are heroically preaching the gospel, right? And he being like the legacy is a failure, an abject failure in a sense, right? But what's amazing is that every time he fails, he's so ashamed of himself that he rises up again and he perseveres even more, right? Just like St. Peter. So it's amazing. I'm not surprised. I imagine that St. Peter would intercede for him in a very special way, knowing and how Father Louis de Gramont would have chosen this name for him. It's so apropos that, he literally lives out that same spirit, that character of St. Peter, and to have a certain endurance and fortitude not to lose faith and to keep that hope alive. But there is also a very endearing story to Lee Seung-hoon, and it has to do with after being baptized and going out to spread the mission, how much he tried to live out the sacraments with great zeal. And I think that this story is so fitting for us today because we have the sacraments so readily accessible at our fingertips, especially here in the United States, that I think it's important for us to learn this story in order for us to have a greater appreciation and reverence for just the sacredness of the sacraments and how blessed we are to have them at our fingertips. So first, it's important, again, after St. Peter Lee he's not a saint yet. Actually, they're praying for his beatification. But Peter Lee, when he was baptized in 1784, he immediately started baptizing as many people as possible. And he shared a letter to the French missionaries in Beijing about the fate of Catholicism in his country in 1789. So, this is 5 years after his arrival back in Korea and after all the debates and, the ongoing evangelizing by all the scholars. At that point, he testifies that they had baptized over 1,000 people, right? This is pretty amazing. And so in this letter, it's actually translated. And I want to read to you certain sections because I think it's just so moving. For one, his humility, and two, his sincerity and simplicity of heart, that he has a real childlike spirit in fearing that he has really wronged the Lord in how he has performed the sacraments. So mind you, again, you have a bunch of Catholics, right, that had very little formation. All their formation is self-studied, right? They didn't have someone, aside from the short stint that Peter Lee got with his time with the priests, there was no real formation. And so they're literally studying their way into the faith by reading books, right? Books that are very short. Some of them are just like pamphlets that explain the faith, the sacraments, and that catechesis, right? But Peter Lee, he writes this letter again to the missionaries in Beijing, and he says, I, Peter Lee, prostrate myself upon the ground and beating my breast in token of my submission and prayers for mercy, confess to my reverend fathers that since the year of 1784, when during that spring I received holy baptism, I've committed grievous sins whereby I have forfeited the grace of God and put myself in the power of the devil, inasmuch as I have not only lost my own soul, but have also been the cause of others' damnation. Alas, is there any corner of the world that might tolerate my presence? What is left for me now but that infinite mercy which has never yet been withheld from me? All these thoughts fill me with fear and enfeeble my consciousness of the great depth of gratitude that I owe. A full account of my sins and of what has occurred here in this young community of Christians will move you to beg God's forgiveness of my sins and to show me the true road of redemption. I'm going to fast forward down. And he says, well, do you know of the blessings of the redemption, but who will make it available to us? Only imagine then, Reverend Fathers, what sorrow and affliction we are in. Have pity upon us, we beseech you. Allow yourselves to be moved by our appeal and extend a helping hand to rescue us, poor shipwrecked souls in danger of drowning. You can hear his desperation because there's no priests, right, to serve them. Now, he expresses a written confession, and he says the following. The following are my sins with an account of the present conditions of this new Christian community. 1. At the time of my baptism, I possessed only a rudimentary knowledge of my responsibilities as a Christian. Is my baptism valid? Ought I to be rebaptized? I await your instructions. 2. I cherished a sincere desire to become a Christian, but this desire was accompanied by the selfish motive of acquiring more knowledge of mathematics. So, mathematics was a very strong draw for him. Because just, the beauty of the logic, it makes sense. But this feared him. Number 3, during my journey to Beijing and back to my country, I handed over the sacred images to the custody of non-believers, who afterward returned them to me. Does this not constitute a profanation of the sacred objects? Number 4, immediately upon my arrival in my country, I felt it most pressing as my duty to study my religion as set forth in the books which I had brought with me and to preach it to my relatives and friends. In the course of this work, I became acquainted with a scholar who had come into possession of a book of our religion, to the study of which he had devoted himself for several years. His effort had not been unavailing, for he had gained some knowledge of the less easily comprehended points, but his faith and fervor far surpassed his knowledge. It is he who has taught and encouraged me. We helped each other to serve God and to lead others to serve him, to the number of 1,000 who embraced the faith. So you can imagine this is Pyok, right? But he says, that the persecution broke out. My family was the worst to suffer, and I was obliged to withdraw from the companionship of my brothers in Christ in order not to bring about a discontinuance of baptism. I delegated 2 other persons to take my place. And so then he talks about confessions and how they heard confessions of each other without a priest. So he says, we had an assembly to discuss how to confess and hear confessions, and it was decided that, and he uses kind of like this diagram, A and B might confess to C, but A and B or B and C must not confess to each other. So there's always like 2 towards one other, not directly to each other. And so that way, there's a certain like boundary, which is very beautiful. Toward autumn of that year, a second assembly was held at which it was decided that I should celebrate Holy Mass and that I should confer the sacrament of confirmation. So now you see that he's really like, okay, we need to do these other sacraments. And so, let's figure out who's going to be who. And so it's amazing. He and 10 other persons break down these different sacred orders. So one person becomes bishop and the others become priests, including himself. And so they practice these sacraments, and it wasn't until 1789 there was a book called Indispensable Points of the Holy Religion. And this is when he realized the gravity of his crimes, of which he confesses he is guilty. So from the end of 1784 until the spring or the fourth month of 1785, he literally knew nothing about what he was doing wrong. And he was literally just requesting to the priest, Father Gromon, certain books so that he can become more familiar whether or not he's doing things correctly. And so he was writing these letters on silk to Father Louis de Gromon, hoping to correspond and get further instruction from him. And it wasn't until 1789 that one of his pupils was able to go and share this hidden letter written on silk cloth to Father Louis. And at the time, the bishop of Beijing, Bishop Juvea, was so impressed by the story of the thousands of Catholic conversions. And while, it's sad that there was just a lack of formation, he was so moved and so enlightened that you have this random guy showing up from a foreign country, speaking a foreign language, but then communicating through the Chinese written language, that all of this amazing evangelization is happening in this foreign country that no priest has stepped foot into, right? And so there's great excitement. But that said, along with the banning of the ancestral worship and the first martyr, right, Thomas Kim, this is when a lot of people started to get cold feet. And so along with having celebrated the sacraments wrong, all these Catholics are thinking we have to go to confession and we totally messed up. And who is here to hear them for us? And so they're starting to lose hope, seeing that many of them are being killed. I mentioned that Seung-hoon's younger brother threw him in, right, in a sense, to apostatize. Also, Pyok's father threatened him that if he doesn't apostatize, that his father would commit suicide. And so that's like a really hard, what do you do in that kind of circumstance, right? Today, thanks be to God, we have this freedom of religion. And so we don't feel that level of persecution. But as soon as these scholars found out that the sacraments that they were celebrating were invalid and that they were wrong and that they were actually doing something that's considered a mortal sin, they were mortified, right? And they were really begging to go to confession, to figure out some way to receive God's mercy, right? To have penance. And so I just want to conclude, so we have this wonderful example of these heroic lay faithful, Peter Lee and John the Baptist Pyok Lee, right? Now, these two have put everything on the line to try to be faithful to the Lord, and they failed, right? In the sense that they apostatized when everyone was counting on them to stay heroic to the last breath. And so, in a sense, it's like, oh my gosh, they're a disgrace. But they're not, because they did so much heroic work, right? 1,000 baptisms over the course of a few years as a lay faithful who came to know the truth of God through their own self-study. And so the missionary priests, they all recognized that should these lay faithful have apostatized, there is great hope that, even in the last moment, they sought God's mercy with great petition for God's forgiveness. And so as we continue on this journey of learning about the Korean martyrs, learning about all the richness of that legacy, I want to invite you to keep in mind just the bigger picture of the universal church. and how this all begins with the 12 apostles, and how they have been missioned to go out and spread the good news, and how this has reached different facets of the world in different periods of the world's history, you know? And it's just amazing that it has reached Korea during this specific time in the last 250 years. And here we are to enjoy that history, to be inspired by it, to see how it connects back to the very beginnings, from China, and from China back to Spain and other parts of Europe, all the way back to Italy, to Rome, where it all began. And so we give thanks to God, and we continue to go deeper into this story as we prepare our hearts for the next podcast. All right. Thank you for tuning in. I'll see you in the next one.